So for those of you just joining, if you would, feel free to respond to the question in the whiteboard in front of you. What were the three most important events in 20th century Jewish history? And we're curious to learn from you and about you. So does everybody know how to use the chat function?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay. So next to participants, you should see chat, and feel free to write in the chat.
I don't even see participants.
Uh,
Oh, I see it on the bottom. Got it.
yes, on the bottom, usually in black and white. Let's see, is anyone writing in the chat? No. Aha. So one comment is perhaps not the most important, but revitalization of Hebrew, I think, is up there. Well,
let's put up the link for the source sheet.
Okay.
We have. Okay. So you click that link, which should be in blue. We get it to the source sheet. I'm also going to put it on the chat in a second.
All right.
Yeah.
Yes, because we have quite a panoply of sources for today without the expectation that we will realistically be able to uncover all of them in a single session. But if you have interest in going into greater depth, you'll be able to do that, of course. Aha. So the founding of the state of Israel, the Shoah, the Holocaust, Jewish refugees, Balfour Declaration. These are some of the responses. Immigration to New York City in the early 1900s. Hebrew language.
Yeah.
Well, Noam, we have lots of different possibilities and proposals.
Yes.
And it seems to me that what the three that you and I were thinking about are indeed at least alluded to, if not directly stated or explicitly stated. Why don't we do the big reveal? You can share what you think or what we think.
What we think, or this suggests based on some scholarship, is definitely the Shoah, the Holocaust, definitely the foundation of the state of Israel. And the third event, we're gonna keep you in suspense for a little bit.
That's right. That's indeed.
And yeah, and I'm gonna mention that last session, we talked about the first three paragraphs of the Israeli Declaration of Independence. And those have the history or historiography of the relation of the Jewish nation to the land of Israel, which according to the declaration, the Jewish nation was founded in Israel, made its political life originally in Israel, and made its culture in Israel. Later was exiled from the land of Israel, hoped and prayed to return, and started returning in the last few decades. So approximately 50 or 60 years, or maybe a little more, before the Declaration of Independence in 1948. And we also looked at some sources that show these different and various aspects of the relation between the Jewish people and the concept of land in general.
And we also considered some of the personalities involved in shaping the, but actually in Hebrew, it's the Megillat Ha'atzmaut, the scroll. It's almost understood in a sacred context, not just a declaration, but somehow hearkening back to sort of the Torah, if you will, of independence, and that the primary writer in this instance was not Moses, but David, and not King David, but David Ben Gurion. And Ben Gurion apparently was up very late at night, the night before the declaration was issued, because he wasn't satisfied with the penultimate draft. He decided to rewrite parts of the declaration. And yet, Noam and I, prior to our getting together as a group, noted that he was not generally a person that was drawn to compromise. However, in this particular case, he went against the grain of his general personality and did compromise and left much of the prior draft or the penultimate draft of the declaration intact, with a few changes to emphasize the peoplehood dimension of this act, that this was not going to be understood as a statement about connecting the state of Israel to ancient Israel, but was going to be a statement of kind of a new Jew, a Jew that was going to enter power history, a Jew that was going to no longer be the objects of history, but the subjects of history, and that we were going to emphasize not Judaism as a religion, but the Jews as a people. Were there any questions that with which we left you hanging last time, or so that we can now begin to move into the documents that were in many respects kind of midwives, if you will, for this birth of the state of Israel? Any questions? All right. We began the last session with taking into account the fact that there are still Hatufim and Hatufot, there are still hostages in Gaza. And we would like, I think, to again, maybe especially given the events of the last 24 and hopefully next, I don't know, 96 hours or so, or perhaps even 42 days, and we'll see how many days it takes for at least some of the hostages who are in Gaza to be released.
So oh, I'm sorry, the wrong screen.
Okay.
No, I think it's the right screen.
Yes, we have I think we have the screen.
אכן,
Yes.
yes. So, אחינו כל בית ישראל, הנתונים בצרה ובשביה, העומדים בין בים ובין ביבשה. המקום ירחם עליהם ויוציאם מצרה לרווחה, ומאפלה לאורה, ומשעבוד לגאולה, השתה בעגלה ובזמן קריב, ונאמר אמן.
As for our brothers and sisters, the whole house of Israel, who are given over to trouble or captivity, whether they abide on the sea or on the dry land, may the All-Present have mercy upon them and bring them forth from trouble to enlargement, from darkness to light, and from subjection to redemption, now speedily and at a near time, as together we say, Amen.
So, with that, we're gonna go to this week's. to this week's source sheet, which I have just posted a link to in the chat. On the top of the source sheet, we definitely encourage anyone to read the full declaration. We have the link up here. We're going to focus on paragraphs 4 to 10 today, which last week we had a comment that perhaps we would have expected the Israeli Declaration of Independence to start just like the American Declaration of Independence with a Declaration of Rights. And this is the equivalent part would be here. Would be this part, basically what are the legal rights that give the Jewish people authority to have their own state. And I've started by putting on all of the text that we'll be going through today, but we're going to break it down. And in fact, this week we're gonna start with the final paragraph of our text today. This right is the natural right of the Jewish people to be masters of their own fate, like all other nations in their own sovereign state. So again, this might be the equivalent of the inalienable rights that the Declaration of Independence for the United States mentions, but in the United States, they speak of individual rights. Here it's a collective right, the right of the Jewish people, the Jewish nation. And if I can get just a quick reaction in the chat, if we just put this statement on its own, would you agree or disagree? Just with that quick statement on its own.
Not working.
Okay, so again, do you agree or disagree? This right is the natural right of the Jewish people to be masters of their own fate, like all other nations in their own sovereign state. So you can put a reaction in the chat. Okay, or if you want, you can just show a thumbs up or thumbs down to the camera. Yeah, you can see the reaction that most are agree, and again, we'll just put it a bit of a trick question because some of the attitudes towards this statement might not be as obvious as it might seem to us today. And we're gonna break down a few issues here. And first of all, we have a definition from the Oxford English Dictionary to what is a nation. So a large aggregate of people so closely associated with each other by factors such as common descent, language, culture, history, and occupation of the same territory, so as to be identified as a distinct people, especially when organized or potentially organizable as a political state. And the reason for putting this up there is just to think of some of the issues. Because at the time, at least the Zionism started, let's look at the issues for the Jewish people. Common descent, definitely something that the Jewish people have, or definitely that they perceive to have. You know, we have genetic studies that show that there is a link between Jewish people of various diasporas, but there's also a wide variety about Jewish people. Second part, though, language, much more questionable in when Zionism begins, at least. We have, of course, the Hebrew language, but it has not been a spoken language at that point for thousands of years. It is a written language, it is a language of prayer, but the everyday language is different for Jews everywhere.
Oh, shit.
Excellent. I think one of the people who responded to our initial question about maybe the three most important events in the 20th century mentioned the rebirth of the Hebrew language. And I think that was a very astute piece of recognition. There are some even today who would argue that the rebirth, the revivification, or the resurrection even of the Hebrew language is nothing short of miraculous, and if not the greatest, one of the greatest accomplishments of
Very good.
the state of Israel. Lastly, I just wanted to mention that this statement that Noam is focusing on, or that we're focusing on right now, is part of the assertion of almost a new concept or a new definition of a Jew. Remember that the word for rights, which here in Hebrew is zechut, it doesn't even exist in the Bible. There isn't a concept of rights, as it were, in ancient Israel. And to this day, it's the case that when someone enters into Jewish adulthood, they don't become bar zechut or bat zechut. They become bar mitzvah. They become bat mitzvah. And that is to say, one of the tensions between sort of Americanism and Judaism since its inception has been the question of whether rights precede responsibilities, or do responsibilities precede rights? Classically, in Jewish thought and in Jewish life, you first accept responsibilities, and then as a consequence of the acceptance of responsibilities or commandments, you then have rights. But here is a very different assertion that prior to any responsibilities, you have natural rights.
And on the subject of language, I do see the comment in the chat, which is an important comment, that before Hebrew, Yiddish was a common language, which is true to an extent, because Yiddish was the spoken language in the Pale of Settlement for Jews in Eastern Europe. It was not necessarily the common language for Jews elsewhere. So definitely not for most Sephardic Jews, most Middle Eastern Jews. Some of them spoke Ladino, some of them spoke Arabic, some of them spoke whatever local language. In Western Europe, Jews have moved away from Yiddish as early as Moses Mendelssohn in the 1700s. He points out that Jews are more likely to read, if they're going to read the Bible, they're going to read it most likely, in his experience, in German, not in Hebrew or in Yiddish. And he writes the first Jewish German translation of the Bible. And there was a lot of clashes within Zionism and outside of Zionism about Yiddish versus Hebrew. There was some Zionists who called Yiddish jargon, sort of sort of a contemptuous tone. They wouldn't call it Yiddish; they would call it jargon. And there is a lot to get into here. But we would just say culture. There are some elements of Jewish culture that are common to Jews all around the world. There are some elements that are widely different. History is the same thing. Would Ashkenazi Jews, for example, count the Spanish expulsion as a major part of their history in this time period? I'm not so sure. Okay. And of course, occupation of the same territory, as we saw last week. The last time that all the Jewish people occupied the same territory was 586 BCE, the destruction of the first temple. So, and yet we have various references to the Jewish people as a nation. However, and I do see the question about sovereignty, really important question, and we will go back to it because it's part of the issues under discussion. But it was especially important for us to ask members of a Reformed temple in 2025 about this statement, because Reform Judaism in America especially had very, very different view of Jewish nationhood than we do. And Rabbi Katzew, can you maybe tell us a bit about the Pittsburgh platform?
Sure, my pleasure. As Noam already foreshadowed, uh, with the sort of invitation to modernity, Reform Jews at the end of the 19th century and Jews who were Zionist took very different turns, so to speak, almost diametrically opposed in the question of whether Jews were primarily a religious community, a dat in Hebrew, or Jews were primarily a people, uh, or Am. Reform Jews said we're primarily a religious community, and Zionists said we're primarily a people. Some of you may know and have even witnessed, say, someone who has embraced Judaism as an adult. And as part of that ceremony of embracing Judaism or adopting Judaism, typically it's the case that they will cite a verse from the book of Ruth, Amech ami ve'Elohayich Elohai, your people will be my people, your God will be my God. And it's the case, and this is an ongoing, I'd say, conundrum for people who are Jews and non-Jews. Well, is Judaism a religion, or is Judaism something other than that, or primarily a people? And yet, I think the ultimate response, not only to this question, but to many others, is that it's a false dichotomy, a false binary, that we are both. And yet in 1885, under the leadership at this point of Isaac Mayer Wise, in particular, the Reform rabbis at their first significant gathering in the United States included this paragraph: we recognize in the modern era of universal culture of heart and intellect the approaching of the realization of Israel's great messianic hope for the establishment of the kingdom of truth, justice, and peace among all men. In that context, we would say humans, I hope. We consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine, nor a sacrificial worship under the sons of Aaron, nor the restoration of any of the laws concerning the Jewish state. So this was a break from the notion of the Jews being a people. And this was one of the founding principles of Reform Judaism, especially Reform Judaism in the United States. And I submit to you that now, what is it, 140 years later, there are still people, especially in the Reform movement, who may indeed sign on to this construct.
Yes. And one legacy of this approach that we have today is the very word temple.
So,
Right?
what they,
And people sometimes don't realize that it's usually only reform. If everyone can mute themselves, please. Although we would want to hear from you, but please mute yourself until we call on you. So it's usually only reform houses of worship that are called temples, right? Conservative or Orthodox are usually called synagogues or shuls or sometimes Jewish center. So the adoption of the word temple for a synagogue was part of a statement saying we no longer hope to go back to the temple in Jerusalem. We have temples here. Okay, I did see, I think even Jay Landau raised their hand.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, well, two things. First, the definition of a nation in the first item that we discussed regarding the declaration doesn't speak about religion at all. It talks about the factors of common descent, language, culture, history, etc. The Pittsburgh Platform was in 1885, and I would say that at that point in time, there was really no realization that the Jews would ever return to Israel. The country was under the control of the Turks and had been for hundreds of years. and that likelihood was slim to none. So I mean, the idea that we would be able to create a nation in Palestine in 1885 was pure fantasy.
Well, maybe we would see, first of all, yes, it was very unlikely at that time, and it's a good point. We would later see that there were people thinking about that already in 1885 and earlier, but we do have the prayers that we mentioned last week, various prayers for the return to the land of Israel. Part of what the early reform movement did was remove those from the prayer books. So even the aspiration of someday a miraculous return to the land of Israel was removed. Okay, but it's a very good point. Thank you. I'm gonna skip. It's hurting me to say I'm going to skip "Awake My People," a poem by Yehuda Leib Gordon, who represented the Haskalah movement, the Enlightenment movement in Jewish culture. But he's basically he is referring to the Jewish people as my people, my nation, Ami, my Am. But he encourages them to assimilate basically and keep Judaism only as a religion, not as a nation, with the most famous quote in the quote being, "Be a man in the streets and a Jew at home." And again, I'm greatly encourage you to read the text. If you can read it in Hebrew, that's great, but the English translation is fine.
I think it's also true with respect to Reform Jews at the turn of the 19th century, or towards the end of the 19th century, that they were seeking to affirm, and even in the words of Isaac Mayer Wise, that America is our Zion. This was a statement of profound loyalty to the United States, that they were not in any way interested in being a fifth column. This wasn't a nation within a nation. It was a constituency that wished to blend in many ways and yet remain a distinct religious community. And as we lived up to our name, as it were, in terms of reform. And we will note that over the course of 50 and then 100 or now 140 years, the reform movement has clearly evolved. But I think it's important to note that at the time Zionism was awakening, that that was one choice that people could make. And another choice that people could make was to assert as primary our religious identity, our spiritual being, and not our political or cultural elements.
Yes. So, but here we're gonna mention for the first time Theodor Herzl and his phrasing of the question. And the students, I see here my mistake. I wrote the student cite 1897. It's actually 1894. But he's saying, I think the Jewish question is no more a social than a religious one, notwithstanding that it sometimes takes these and other forms. It is a national question, which can only be solved by making it a political world question to be discussed and settled by the civilized nations of the world and council. And now I see that by mistake, I took off the most famous quote, which I wanted to include, and I will fix it by the time we upload the sheet to the website, which the next phrase is, "We are people, one people." And so that is Herzl's statement. We are people, one people. We need to be organized as one people. If we were to be left in peace, if we could only be left in peace, we would not need any of this. We would not need Zionism, we would not need our own state. But I think we shall not be left in peace. That is Herzl's statement in 1894. And we will see the ways in which he sought to solve the problem. But I will put one more phrase here, which is the phrase, "like all other nations." Okay? And we want to be like everybody else in our own sovereign state, and alluding to the idea that there is a right of nations to have their own state. There is a natural right. By the way, if you notice, first of all, in this paragraph, talking about the natural right of the Jewish people to have their own sovereign state. This paragraph by itself does not mention the idea that this Jewish state should be in the land of Israel, but just the very idea of a Jewish state. But the idea of being like all other nations is also something that is a new concept, because traditionally Jews did not consider themselves to be like all other nations. Jews consider themselves to be the chosen people. And we brought one example of this, just really shows the stark distinction in the Havdalah service. At the end of Shabbat, we have Havdalah, which literally means separation. We separate Shabbat and the days of the week. And part of those blessings are, praise to you, Adonai our God, sovereign of the universe, who distinguishes between the sacred and the profane, between light and dark, between Israel and the nations, between the 7th day and the 6 days of work. Praise to you, Adonai, who distinguishes between the holy and the ordinary.
And
So,
I think it's important to note, because I suspect some of us, I don't even have to just say some of you, some of us can recall that the Reform movement, up until about 40 years ago, deleted the phrase, did not have in our prayer book, Bein Yisrael Amim, did not have a distinction between Israel and the nations. And that was very conscious. That's not in 1885, that's in 1975. This has been a significant, slow-moving, almost, I would say, glacial in its movement to accept in Reform Jewish contexts the notion of the Jews as a people, and as a people that is in any way distinct from other nations. And it's reflected in the latest recension, in the latest Siddur of the Reform prayer book of the Reform movement. This phrase is indeed included, between Israel and the nations.
yes, and on purpose, I've taken this translation from Mishkan Tefillah, which we use at WRT.
I wanted to stop, if we could, for just a moment. What do people know about Theodor Herzl? Who was this person? Do we have any journalists here?
Foreign lawyers.
Yes. The fact that he was, yes, the father of political Zionism, he, for our purposes, and I think that the quotes that Noam cited from 1894 are very important, because he was, Theodor Herzl was witness to a trial of Alfred Dreyfus in France. Yes, excellent. I see Joanne, yes, reporting on the Dreyfus trial. And indeed, it was in relation to having witnessed that trial that Herzl, became convinced that if in a country like France, that was perceived to be culturally and politically advanced, if not on the cutting edge of asserting human freedom and rights, if there could still be overt, public, and acknowledged anti-Semitism, that this was it was going to be everywhere. It was ubiquitous in every concept, in every state, and as a consequence, it led him to believe that the Jews absolutely needed a sovereign state in which they could determine that there would be no anti-Semitism, but otherwise it was going to be sort of an impossible dream for there to be any state, any nation that was not a sovereign Jewish state that was going to be devoid of anti-Semitism.
Yes. And we will actually see that now because, as I said, all of this was a reaction to the last paragraph. Today, we're going back to the beginning of our text today, and here we'll read about what the Declaration of Independence has to say about Herzl. So in the year 56-57, 1897, in the summer of the spiritual father of the Jewish state, Theodor Herzl, the Fourth Zionist Congress convened and proclaimed the right of the Jewish people to national rebirth in its own country. So I'm going to note that the name Theodor Herzl is the only person's name. He's the only person whose name appears in the Declaration of Independence, unless you count the signatures at the end. So, and I'm also including this picture, which we've seen last week as well, of David Ben-Gurion reading the Declaration, and Herzl's picture is hanging above his head. So both by the text and by the visual arrangement of the Declaration, there's a clear indication that Theodor Herzl is a central figure, and he definitely is. However, I do have to point out that Theodor Herzl was not the founder of Zionism. Zionism was around before Herzl joined the movement or had his own variation on the movement. Herzl, at an earlier point in his life, Herzl believed in assimilation. He thought that the Jewish people could just become members of whichever nation they belong to. He even at some point contemplated the idea of his children converting to Christianity and viewing it as something that could be a viable option. Ironically, after his death and after he abandoned that idea, some of his children did convert to Christianity, and at a point where he would not have approved of that. But it's not to go against Herzl, just to say that there were other ideas. So, for example, actually, to give some historical background, we're going to go to 1882, but we need to start in 1881. In 1881, the Russian Tsar Alexander II was assassinated. There was the conspiracy that led to his assassination, including about 10 people, one of which was a young Jewish woman. His successor, I believe it was Alexander III, right? I think he decided to blame the Jews overall. That led to a series of, on the one hand, pogroms in Jewish settlements. On the other hand, what were known as the May laws, which were a series of anti-Semitic laws restricting what Jews were allowed to work and to have their occupation, restricting their access to university, having some economic restrictions, and that led to a massive exodus of Eastern European Jews, which people here mentioned the immigration to New York City. That's where it begins. 1881 to 1914, that's the mass immigration. The vast majority of the people who leave go to the United States. Some go elsewhere, but some of them start having the idea of going back to the land of Israel. And one of these people was Judah Leib Pinsker, who writes a book, very important book called Auto-Emancipation in 1882. And really, it's hard to really sum it up about one of the most important things he said. The only solution is the creation of a Jewish nationality of people living upon its own soil, the auto-emancipation of the Jews, the return to the ranks of the nations by the acquisition of a Jewish homeland. And he does mention in his book, could it be in the land of Israel, in Palestine? He mentions it as a possibility. He says it doesn't have to be there just because of viability, but he mentions it as a possibility. We do have, and we'll look at the population tables, I think, the week after next, that the Jewish population of the land of Israel triples at this time. And because this is the beginning of what's known as practical Zionism. These are simply people leaving mostly Eastern Europe, although there is also a significant aliyah away from Yemen at this time, and moving to the land of Israel to establish a new society there. Now, here comes, and this is someone I cannot talk about the history of Zionism without mentioning, Echad Ha'am. Partly because I wrote my master's thesis on Echad Ha'am, and another important Zionist leader, in 1889, he writes The Wrong Way, in which he reacts to that wave of immigration to the land of Israel, and he points out that if your idea is to restart a Jewish nationality, you're not doing a good job, because the job is in the land of Israel, because only very few of the people who were living in Eastern Europe actually lived to the land of Israel. And Echad Ha'am is writing it in Odessa in 1889. His real name, as I said, is Asher Tzvi Ginsburg. Echad Ha'am is a pen name. It means one of the people. So he said, let us return to the road on which we started when our idea first arose. Instead of adding yet more ruins, let us endeavor to give the idea itself strong roots and strengthen and deepen its hold on the Jewish people, not by force but by the Spirit. Then we shall, in time, have possibility of doing actual work. So that's what's known as cultural Zionism. The idea of persuading the Jewish people itself take part in a new national rebirth. So we have practical Zionism, which is just immigration to Israel, cultural Zionism, the persuasion of the people. When Herzl joins the fray in 1894, he brings in political Zionism, which his idea is being, let's get a mandate, a charter from the nations of the world. So we had a question about, is that, do we need a condition from the nations? According to Herzl, yes. And we need the nations of the world to agree on a Jewish homeland somewhere. Initially, he does again mention Palestine as a possibility. He does not marry himself to that idea in 1894. And in fact, he says, we can't start settlement before we know we have a permission to begin our own state. This all led in 1897, again, the text talks, the first Zionist Congress in 1897, and they eventually, in the resolution, blend those three different streams of Zionism. So first of all, they agreed on the definition for Zionism. Zionism aims at establishing for the Jewish people a publicly and legally assured home in Palestine. Just note, they on purpose do not use the word state. They are on purpose of being vague about it. Some of it is they think maybe it would be seen as too adventurous, too aspirational, and so an assured home in Palestine, for whatever that means, for the aspect of this purpose. But they do, by the way, agree here, which again, Herzl wasn't sure about before, but at this point, the aim is Palestine. A land anywhere else will not work. For the attainment of this purpose, the Congress considers the following means serviceable. 1, the promotion of settlements of Jewish agriculturists, artisans, and tradesmen in Palestine. It's cultural Zionism. 2, the federation of all Jews into local or general groups according to the laws of the various countries, and the strengthening of the Jewish feeling and consciousness. That's cultural Zionism. Preparatory steps for the attainment of these governmental grants, which are necessary for the achievement of the Zionist purpose. That is political Zionism. And we have the famous quote in his diary. Why, to sum up the Basel Congress, Basel is the city in Switzerland where the Congress was taking place. In order to sum it up in a word, which I shall guard against pronouncing publicly, it would be this. At Basel, I founded the Jewish state. If I say this out loud today, I would be greeted by universal laughter. In 5 years, perhaps, and certainly in 50 years, everyone will perceive it. So notice the time frame, 50 years. This is, oh, I switched the letters here, it's 1897.
1897, yeah.
Yes, so 51 years later is when Israel is established as a state. So he actually got the numbers just right. The reason I can tell you, by the way, the reason I got the numbers wrong here is he did write it on September 3rd, 1897, but September 3rd, 1987 is my birthday. So I think that's what made me transpose the numbers here. But again, I don't know if we need to go, again, recommend you read it for yourself. At about the same time, July 1897, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, which is the main body of American rabbis of the Reform movement, has their annual conference, and as a result, we totally disapprove any attempt of the establishment of a Jewish state.
I don't know if anyone has comments or questions. I realize that this is a lot of information, some of which may be quite new, but from at least my perspective, what I would hope you would be able to already discern is that not only in 2025, but also in 1885 and 1887 and 1882 and 1897, we have never been a, quote, united Jewish people. Those are, slogans and aspirations. It's the case that there has been an ongoing debate about the extent to which we're a religious community, the extent to which we're a people, the extent to which we are a nation, the extent to which we should have a state. And it was important to note that even, I think in 2018, Gil Troy wrote a book called The Zionist Ideas, recognizing that even Zionism is not one idea. The Zionism of Ahad Ha'am was not at all leading to a political entity. It was leading to a sort of cultural, spiritual home that would be uh, fruitful for Jewish literature, for music, for poetry, for Jewish life to be renewed. But it wasn't the case that he was looking to have an army, a parliament, a Knesset, a Supreme Court. And we're seeing much of this even in our played out day to day, that there are multiple conflicting narratives of what it means to be a Jew, and quite frankly, also even what it means to be a Zionist. And yet, Herzl was something of a prophet to have imagined in 1897 when he said it was completely laughable. And I think it was Jay Landau. You were absolutely correct. It was, you'd have to be on something, I guess, to think that in 1897 that the Jewish people within just a couple of generations are going to have a state, and within 140 years, that would be the most powerful state in the Mideast. You would just have been perceived of as needing to be put in a straitjacket. But at this point in 1897, we have somebody who has sort of a prescient element to his political strategy. And of course, what he didn't foresee, at least to the degree that it developed, was one of the most horrific events or processes in all of Jewish memory, that being the Shoah.
And again, we included these statements from the Central Conference of American Rabbis just because as members of a Reform temple, it's important to see how the American Reform movement sees it. Now, this is the mainstream American Reform movement. It's important to note that at the same time, July 1897, one of the largest leaders of Zionism in America is a Reform rabbi, Rabbi Stephen Weiss. no, it's ironic that we have the two Rabbi Weiss. We have Isaac Meir Weiss, the founder of American Reform Judaism, who is very distinctly against Zionism. At this conference, he gives his last public address, and a lot of it is just an anti-Zionist address. But at the same time, we have this other Rabbi Weiss, Rabbi Stephen Weiss, in New York City, who is a Zionist and will be one of the leaders of American Reform Zionism for, I think, the next 20 years or so. Okay. And I think we have to skip the Columbus platform, just to say 1937, same body, the CCAR adopts a more moderate resolution. This time they're saying they actually do see value in establishing a Jewish state in Palestine. And although they still don't completely affirm it as the official line of Reform Judaism, they see it as a legitimate option. So one thing that happened by 1947 is, of course, the rise of Nazism in 1933. But something else happened, and that is what we would say is the third major event. And Rabbi Katzew, do you want to share the slide? And it might not at first seem, the connection to Zionism might not be obvious at first, but we're talking about the 1924 Reed-Johnson Act, which limited immigration to the United States. Yeah, and Rabbi Katzew, go ahead. You're muted. Rabbi Katzew, you're muted. Okay?
Okay. Yes, thank you. Sorry about that. Hopefully everybody can see this this screen here. We wanted to keep you a bit in suspense about what Noam and I agreed was arguably the third most important event in the 20th century in Jewish life. And the Reed-Johnson Act, passed in 1924, is, of course, a very important palimpsest, a very important background, given the fact that at this moment, one of the determining factors in American life is our attitude towards immigration. Well, in 1924, this is after a period between 1881 and 1924, in which, give or take, 2.5 million Jews immigrated to the United States. But in 1924, the Reed-Johnson Act limited immigration to, I believe it's 2% of any nationality as of the census of 1890. And as a consequence, and these are slides, as you can see, from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, almost immediately there was a profound and drastic reduction of immigration, of all immigration, but in particular also of Jewish immigration to the United States. That actually lasted until 1965, but we can see that for decades, even that quota was not reached, and even the 2% number was not reached, and as a consequence, as you can see, an average of just under 125,000 people immigrated to the United States between 1925 and 1932. And just to put that in context, there were years in which the Jewish immigration alone to the United States came very close to 125,000 people. So this meant, and it led Chaim Weizmann, who became the first president of Israel, basically to say that the world is divided into places where Jews are not at home and Jews are not welcome anywhere. So this was one of the forces, if you will, one of the centrifugal forces that ultimately had a profound impact on the Jews perceiving that there was a need for a state of their own in which Jews could be sovereign. Here is another regrettably sort of damning slide you already mentioned, and then with this we will move, I guess, a little bit back in time to the Balfour Declaration. But we wanted to mention, since 1933 was mentioned already as the time that Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, you can see that most of the people who were seeking to immigrate to the United States from Germany were Jewish, and only 1,241 Germans received a visa, and 82 or 83,000 on a waiting list, and the United States did not even come close to allowing the 2% that would have been the maximum at that time allowed into the United States. I'll stop there.
Yes, and we will need to move quickly to the Balfour Declaration. So this right to the Jewish people to have their own land was established in the Balfour Declaration that several people mentioned in the chat. We can actually take a look at the actual document with the signature of Lord James Arthur Balfour, who was the foreign minister for the British government, the British cabinet. And the main part of the declaration says, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, using the same terms as the Basel program, and again, trying to avoid the word state. We use the best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, and important note here, being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious right of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Now, the term Palestinian, as we know it today, existed, wasn't in far used today. So they're just saying non-Jewish communities, or the rights of political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. That was added in there mostly to reassure British Jews that there will be no change in their status at all. Okay, but this was significant. First of all, because for the first time we have a major world government acknowledging Zionism and endorsing Zionism. But it's also important for what happened next. And I'm just going to show this image, and I'm going to ask, you can raise your hand or put in the chat, does anyone recognize where this image was taken?
Maybe you can give them a hint.
Well, the hint would be when. No, the hint, I think some of the, definitely I was, but some of the people in this chat, I'm sure, have been to this location. Yes, so Joanne says Jerusalem city.
Yes. You're really warm.
Yeah, no, that is it. That's
Yes.
yeah, that's the Jaffa Gate in the old city of Jerusalem. And if you go here today, it looks pretty much the same today, except this road, which is a dirt road here, is now paved. And the moon and crescent, which were the emblem of the Ottoman Empire, are not here anymore. The person in front is the British General Edmund Allenby. And this is him marching into Jerusalem on December 11, 1917. So just over a month after the Balfour Declaration, the British are moving, the British army is taking the land of Palestine, the land of Israel, from the Ottoman Empire. It take him a few months to complete the conquest, but it's now not just a major world power acknowledging and endorsing Zionism. It's the world power that has control of the land of Israel. So with that, we're gonna see the next part in the state. recognizing the Balfour Declaration and reaffirmed the mandate of the League of Nations, which in particular gave international sanction to the historic connection between the Jewish people and Eretz Israel, and to the right of the Jewish people to rebuild its national home. So what are mandates? We're going to the end of the First World War, the establishment of the League of Nations. And in the Covenant of the League of Nations, Article 22 talks about mandates. To those colonies and territories, which as a consequence of the late war have ceased to be under the sovereignty of the states which formerly governed them, and which are inhabited by people not yet able to stand by themselves under the strenuous condition of the modern world. So they recognize that the empires of the world a lot of them have receded after the First World War. Some of these nations are able to just become their own country. Europe has a whole bunch of new countries established here, but some of these people are not yet ready and not yet able. And here we get to some of the what some might call maybe Orientalism, what some might call sort of the disrespect or talking down to these people, because who exactly is it they get to decide who is able and who is not able to stand by themselves? Well, the League of Nations is, and to those people who are not yet able, we're going to give mandates to some of the other stronger nations. They're going to give practical effort, and they should be entrusted to advanced nations to teach them how to stand by themselves.
Yeah, I think this is really of vital importance to understand the context, not just historically, but I'd say geopolitically of the declaration of Israel's independence ultimately. The idea of who deserves a country, who is able indeed to be considered among the family of nations, ends up being a critical question that, quite frankly, one we're still dealing with at this very moment, literally at this very moment. And I'm thinking, of course, with respect to Gaza and and Palestinians. I think it's vital to note that the Balfour Declaration, which several of you mentioned as one of the most important events in all of 20th century, especially Jewish history, was just a letter to one person, Lord Rothschild, who was the leader of a British Zionist group. It wasn't from one government to another government. And in many senses, quite frankly, it was the result of something that Chaim Weizmann did. Does anybody know, prior to him becoming the first president of the State of Israel, Weizmann was a very significant scientist. And because of the fact that in Great Britain, during its prosecution of World War I, they were in desperate need of acetone, and it was the case that for explosions and all kinds of weaponry, it was the case that they used Chaim Weizmann, who was the chemist who figured out how acetone could, instead of being purchased from Germany, which was the way that Great Britain had done it, that they could use a method of fermentation to develop on a grand scale its own acetone. Basically, Lord Balfour said, okay, what ultimately do you want for this massive contribution to the war effort? And he said, Weizmann said, we want a home. We want a Jewish national home in Palestine. And Balfour, who was then foreign secretary, was able to get the leadership in Great Britain to write this letter to Lord Balfour. One other backstory that I think is relevant for American Jews is the role of Louis Brandeis. Weizmann, from Great Britain, wrote to Louis Brandeis and said, we need your help in convincing Woodrow Wilson to support the Balfour Declaration. Woodrow Wilson's own Secretary of State was against the Balfour Declaration, but it was the case that Wilson had formed a very close relationship with Brandeis, and Louis Brandeis intervened, interceded, and ended up convincing Wilson to write a letter to Balfour saying the United States would support the Balfour Declaration, perhaps without Louis Brandeis being involved in the backstory. The Balfour Declaration never would have even been issued. And I think that, at least from my perspective, uncovering some of the backstory and the way that individuals have enormous influence over what ultimately is Jewish history, not only in the biblical period, but even in our lifetimes or in the modern period, is very important to recognize, because, quite frankly, we are living at a turning point in Jewish history as we speak. And there are undoubtedly individuals, and their roles may never be known, or they may be known only generations from now, that have profound impact on what ultimately occurs in our own history.
Yes. And that is definitely important. And the Balfour Declaration is part of what then is acknowledged by the League of Nations in establishing the British Mandate. And I'm looking at a little bit of the text for the mandate. Again, full text is fascinating, and there is a link here. But one of the things they said is that the purpose of the mandate is to secure the establishment of the Jewish national home. And we did include some parts that talk about freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, other populations. And Article 22, English, Arabic, and Hebrew shall be the official languages of Palestine. This is the closest thing. This is the only time, basically, where they acknowledge that there are Arab people living here. It's the closest thing to acknowledging Arab nationhood in this mandate. This is important to say, first of all, because there is another nation that has its formative years at this time, and we're not seeing its history at this moment. But also, when we see now some of the talking points of some of the anti-Zionist movement, they bring up, look, before there was Israel, there was Palestine. And look, here's a map from 1946 that says Palestine. Here's a coin that says Palestine, ignoring that the same coin would also say Eretz Israel in Hebrew. But it's important to know that Palestine, the entity that they're talking about, is this British mandate for Palestine, which is established to secure the establishment of a Jewish national home. This is before the time that the word Palestine became associated with specifically the Arab population of this land. It's simply, at this point, it's simply a description of the geographical area that we call the land of Israel. The other associations come later. And I think this is important in current debate, because while it's definitely important to discuss the two-state solution, it's definitely important to say whether there should and can be a Palestinian state. I think the answer to both of this is yes. Also important to go against this myth that there ever was a Palestinian state, a Palestinian self-government that Israel has taken over. That simply was not something that ever existed. And this is not a narrative. This is any even superficial look into the history would show you that. Okay, but moving on, going back to the text, and this part, we get to the Holocaust, but we will actually not spend a lot of time here, simply because we do not need to give you documents to explain to you what the Holocaust was, what caused it. We believe you all already know it. It is interesting to look at how the Declaration of Independence frames it. It starts with the word the catastrophe. In Hebrew, what it says here is HaShoah. HaShoah, which literally means the catastrophe. At this point, I believe that the writing of the declaration did not yet have the connotation of simply referring to the Holocaust as we do today. But I think the fact that it was referred to it this way in the declaration is part of what led to it being the name that we use in Hebrew. So the catastrophe which recently befell the Jewish people, the massacre of millions of Jews in Europe, was another clear demonstration of the urgency of solving the problem of its homelessness by re-establishing in Eretz Israel the Jewish state, which would open the gates of the homeland wide to every Jew and confer upon the Jewish people the status of a fully privileged member of the Committee of Nations. Survivors of the Nazi Holocaust in Europe, by the way, it's interesting, we only mentioned one person, Theodor Herzl. We also mentioned Balfour by his last name, but the name Nazi made it into the Declaration of Independence, which is an interesting choice. Survivors of the Nazi Holocaust in Europe, as well as Jews from other parts of the world, continued to migrate to Eretz Israel, undaunted by difficulties, restrictions, and dangers, and never ceased to assert their rights to a life of dignity, freedom, and honest toil in their national homeland. In the Second World War, and this is now is going to take a twist to another aspect of the Second World War, other than the Holocaust. And this is definitely something that was important to Ben-Gurion and to many people back then. They did not like the idea of the Jewish people simply as victims, as passive, especially victims. So they're going to emphasize another part of the Jewish people in the Second World War. In the Second World War, the Jewish community of this country, meaning the Jewish people in Israel, contributed its full share to the struggle of the freedom and peace-loving nations against the forces of Nazi wickedness, and by the blood of its soldiers and its war effort, gained the right to be reckoned among the peoples who founded the United Nations. So there were Jewish soldiers from mandatory Palestine who took part. I've included probably the most famous, Hannah Senesh, who was part of a paratrooper group that landed down in various places in Europe to gather intel and to help organize local partisan group as part of the British Army. I have her last poem, "Blessed is the Match," which again, for lack of time, we would skip, but please read on your own. And finally, we're going back. On the 29th of November, 1947, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution calling for the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel. The General Assembly required the inhabitants of Eretz Israel to take such steps as was necessary on their part for the implementation of that resolution. This recognition by the United States of the right of the Jewish people to establish their state is irrevocable. So we have a resolution, it's what, about 5 months before the establishment of the State of Israel, passing a resolution basically to end the British mandate. And what they're saying is to call for a Jewish state in Eretz Israel, which is only one part of what the United Nations decided. They did decide to establish a Jewish state, but and here is when I maybe throw it to the participants. How many of you have heard of the partition plan of 1947? And can anyone share what they know about the partition plan? Okay, so Joanne, go ahead.
What I remember is that there were supposed to be two states created, one for Palestinians, one for Jews, and the Jews, Israelites, I don't know, I'm not sure the preferred terminology here, but the Palestinians said, no way, Jose, we want it all. We don't like this plan. And then they had their own catastrophe after that.
Okay, does anyone want to add anything?
I
Okay,
thought,
so
right, I thought that Jordan was supposed to be the Palestinian state in
no,
the,
so
right?
we mentioned before the British Mandate for Palestine. In fact, its full name was the British Mandate for Palestine and Transjordan. So they also had a mandate for Jordan, so on this side, the eastern side of the River Jordan. But in 1946, Jordan became its own independent kingdom. Whether the idea was, as some people in the Zionist movement have claimed, that actually Transjordan should also be part of the land of Israel, and some people have later claimed that here we already had a two-state solution. We parted this mandate into two parts. But it was not established. The idea of establishing it was not as a homeland for the Arab people who lived in the state of Israel. It was its own territory. But this is a good point that some people have been making sense. We will point. So it was a proposal by this group, UN Scope, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, which was established specifically to work out what are we going to do about this area where we have these two groups fighting for control. It's not the first time that a two-state solution has been established. It was 11 years earlier in what's called the Peel Commission, P-E-E-L Commission. But this is the one that made it to the United Nations. I will say that vote that accepted the partition plan on November 29, 1947 happened in the old United Nations building, the old United Nations General Assembly building, which is in what's today Borough Park in Queens. So I actually like to point out to my students, you can visit a site of Israeli history in just a 40-minute drive. So
I'm
yeah.
sorry, go ahead, finish, and then I'd like to add something.
So yeah, the basic idea was dividing the land into two states. We have the Arab state, again, they don't call it Palestinian state yet. The Arab state in yellow, Jewish state in green, and an international area around Jerusalem in white.
I would like just briefly to cite the Peel Commission report and share it with you if I can. Can folks see this? Because of the fact, as Noam has indicated, really since the time of the Balfour Declaration, or even before that, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the year before, 1916, there were ongoing conversations about the possibility of a Jewish state, of a Jewish homeland, of an Arab state, of an Arab homeland. And it's important to note, as is the case now, that sometimes the interests, political, economic, military, of different countries overlap, but they almost never coincide. So, from the perspective of Great Britain, they at times were currying favor with Jews. At times they were currying favor with Arabs because they needed allies in the Middle East. At times they were currying favor with the French, at times with the Americans. They are all seeking at various points to do what they perceive as in their own self-interest. So the Peel Commission, this was, in this case, a British Royal Commission, they were trying to figure out, why is there so much internecine battling in the land, in what was Palestine at this point, between Jews and Arabs? They can never seem to agree on how to coexist. And in particular, between 1936 and 1939, it even started earlier, there was a massive Arab revolt, and as a consequence, there were Jews killed, there were Arabs killed, and the British decided we need to investigate. It's now we're now 20 years into the mandate, starting in 1917, and this whole scenario is completely impossible to contain. So they went to different constituencies in an effort to figure out how could they develop at least some modus vivendi for people living and coexisting together in Palestine. So with respect to the Jews, the Jewish national home is no longer an experiment. The growth of its population has been accompanied by political, social, and economic developments along the lines laid down at the outset. The chief novelty is the urban and industrial development. The contrast between the modern democratic and primarily European character of the national home and that of the Arab world around it is striking. The temper of the home is strongly nationalist. There can be no question or fusion or assimilation between Jewish and Arab cultures. The national home cannot be half national. The British Commission decided in 1937, no way can there be a binational state. These folks cannot coexist in a single state. That was their conclusion in 37. Then they said, okay, the Arab nationalism is just as intense a force as Jewish. The Arab leaders' demand for national self-government and the shutting down of the Jewish national home has remained unchanged since 1929. They are unalterably, ineluctably opposed to a Jewish national home. Like Jewish nationalism, Arab nationalism is stimulated by the education system, by the growth of the youth movement. It's been greatly encouraged by Anglo-Egyptian and Franco-Syrian treaties. The gulf between the races is thus already wide and will continue to widen if the present mandate is maintained. I don't need to read any more of this, because I think here's the conclusion. Neither of the two national ideals permits of combination in the service of a single state. Now, I don't know about you, but when I read this from 1937, I'd say, well, this in many ways could be a conclusion of a commission in 2024 or 2025. It's just, I think, vital to know, prior to the advent of the partition plan in 1947 and the War of Independence from the Jewish perspective, or Nakba, the great catastrophe from the Arab perspective, this has been an ongoing, seemingly intractable, seemingly inevitable clash between two nationalist expressions. And I'm not saying this to say that it can never be resolved, God forbid, but I think it's important to note that what we are witnessing literally in our own generation is in many, many respects a revision of what has been experienced over the course of the whole last century.
Yeah, and I want to go back to the map, and especially as Joanne pointed out rightly that the Jews by and large accepted and celebrated the partition plan. The Arabs by and large did not, and eventually turned to forceful resistance of the partition plan. But we're gonna need to ask why. And I think by this point we can understand why the Jews were excited for the plan. Let's try and think why the Palestinians, and maybe anachronistic term, why were the Arabs opposed to the plan? I'm gonna ask that you think and suggest why would the Arabs oppose the plan?
Why did you say why wouldn't they support the plan?
Yes, why did they oppose it?
They opposed it because the Jews were getting more land than they felt that they deserved. There was a bigger piece, and they were getting um, they were not getting it was a thing about land and how who had more and who had less, and they felt that the Jewish state was getting more land than the Arab state was.
And that was part of the opposition. It did point out that Jews got 55% of the land. On the other hand, Jews pointed out a lot of it is the Negev desert, which was a desert at this point. Also, that the way the borders were designed were basically by population. So they did try to get as few Arabs in the Jewish state and few Jews in the Arab state. And Jews would also point out that there are, yes, we have more land, but we have strategic issues with this passage, with this passage. Arabs have a better access to Jerusalem. So they would point out that when you take all of this into account, it's more or less equal. But let's suppose, even for the sake of argument, suppose that we could somehow split it 50-50. Would that be something that the Arabs at the time would accept?
No,
Why?
because they wanted it all.
They wanted it all, as do we, by the way. Let's not pretend that when we walk into our classrooms, we don't see this map, this entire map shown as Israel. But from the Arab perspective, there have been Arabs living, there have been Muslims living in this land for about 1500 years at that point. It has been very established as an Arab Muslim land with maybe a Jewish minority, maybe other minorities there. When I showed this to students, to my sixth graders and even fourth graders, I said, imagine that you're living in your home and someone comes along and says, you know, I know this is your home now, but this was my family's home 50 years ago. So now we need to live in it together. And then we go to court and the court says, okay, so we'll just split the home and you can both share it. None of us would think that's a fair solution. So that is something to think about, to understand where the Arabs are coming from.
Jay, Eve?
Yeah, I don't think it was an issue of land more than the Arab mindset that with the aid of Jordan, Lebanon, maybe Syria and Egypt, that they would be able to destroy the nascent Jewish state, which didn't come to pass, and they tried it again and again and failed and leave themselves in a worse position than they were in 1947.
Right.
I think that's really the reasoning. I don't think it had anything to do with the amount of land.
Right. Even though at this point, there are still not, there has been, the war of independence has started, but this time it's only within these borders. It's the Arabs of the land of Israel that are fighting against the Jews. They are not, they're supported maybe morally by the Arab states. They're not yet supported militarily. That's going to be the morning after the Declaration of Independence that the Arab states.
And in somewhat in the same manner as we had discussed the Reed-Johnson Act that significantly limited immigration to the United States beginning in 1924, it's important to note that Great Britain, in many respects, spoke out of both sides of its mouth. On the one hand, we have the Balfour Declaration that we looked at that said, yes, we will look favorably upon a Jewish national home in Palestine. And then, not that much later, they wrote a white paper, basically rescinding it and saying, well, it couldn't have meant over the objection of the Arab population in Palestine. And just to sort of reinforce that rhetoric, they severely, again, just like the Reed-Johnson Act, limited immigration of Jews at a crucial time when Jews were trying to leave the area under German hegemony to go to Palestine. They couldn't. And that's why in the Declaration of Independence, of Israel's Declaration of Independence, they explicitly mention ma'apilim, people who are illegal immigrants who made it into Israel over against the severe limitations in population. So when we look at it in a future session at the population of Jews and non-Jews between 1517 and 1948, you will see a profound decrease, just like we saw after 1924 to the United States, because all of a sudden the British said, okay, we're done with having this open immigration. The Balfour Declaration has been realized. There are 450,000 Jews who have made it to Palestine. We're done. But the Jews weren't done.
And the British also point out that that the Balfour Declaration says a Jewish homeland in Palestine, not a Jewish homeland over all of Palestine. But I think let's just take a look at I will say just a very quick note. This is from the text of the partition plan, and they mention a declaration shall be made to the provisional government of each proposed state before independence, each could stand, among others, and there's a long list of things the declaration needs to contain. Only reason I'm including is this is the reason we have a declaration of independence for the state of Israel. It's because the partition plan said you need to make a declaration. And initially, the legal department of the Jewish agency proposed a very legalistic list. It did not turn out that way. Okay. And again, if you can read the full text, there's a lot there. But we finish where we started. This recognition by the United Nations of the right of the Jewish people to establish their state is irrevocable. Another way to say irrevocable is inalienable. The right is the natural right of the Jewish people to be masters of their own fate, like all other nations in their own sovereign state. And we are past the end of our time, but does anyone have any more questions or comments?
Noam, you're raising your hand.
Oh, I did not mean to. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, I'm
if there
going
are
to.
no questions at this point, then we certainly thank you for attending and for participating, and recognize that there is an awful lot here of both documentation and significant, hopefully, justification that is leading to what ultimately became the scroll of Israel's independence. And we will continue looking at it very closely, because it really is, I think, as close as we have to this day of a modern sacred text that articulates the ideals and aspirations of the state of Israel, some of which may have been realized partially, others of which remain aspirational, just like our own declaration.